Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I want to ask a quick question. From which cities are you watching us right now? I always love seeing where our viewers are tuning in from. It really makes this feel like a shared conversation across the country. And if you enjoy this story, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. Your support helps me bring more heartfelt stories like this to life, and I promise you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let me take you back to a day that, at first, seemed ordinary but ended up changing the way I think about connections and understanding people. It was a late spring afternoon, the kind of day where the sun hangs lazily over the horizon, casting golden light across everything it touches. I had agreed to meet my friend, Marianne, at the small park near the river that ran behind her neighborhood. She mentioned her nephew, Ethan, might join us, and I felt a slight pang of curiosity. I had met him once or twice before. He was in his late 20s, tall, with an easy smile that carried warmth, but also a hint of shyness. But I wasn't expecting that our short walk would leave such a lasting impression on me. When I arrived, Marianne was waving from the edge of the riverbank, her broad-brimmed sun hat slipping slightly as she smiled. Beside her stood Ethan, hands tucked loosely into the pockets of his jeans, his gaze scanning the river as if it held some secret meant only for him. "Glad you could make it," Marianne said, her voice bright. "Ethan and I thought a little walk along the river would do us all good. The weather's perfect for it." I nodded and returned her smile. Perfect sounds about right. I looked at Ethan, feeling a little self-conscious, wondering what he might think of me, of these quiet, unscripted moments we were about to share. As we began walking along the winding path beside the river, the water shimmered like liquid glass, catching fragments of the late afternoon sun. Ducks floated lazily by, leaving ripples that faded slowly, and the smell of fresh grass mingled with the faint, earthy scent of the riverbank. It was peaceful in a way that made words both easy and heavy all at once. Ethan was surprisingly talkative, and I found myself leaning into his observations. He had a way of noticing small details, the curve of a tree branch, the sound of a bird's call, the way sunlight pooled in tiny pockets along the water's edge, that made me feel like I was seeing the river for the first time through his eyes. He spoke with thoughtfulness, careful yet open, and I realized I was beginning to enjoy this conversation more than I had anticipated. "You know," he said quietly, "there's something about rivers that makes you think about the flow of everything. Life, people, moments. You can't stop it, but you can choose how you move with it." His words caught me off guard. I paused mid-step, glancing at him with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. There was a depth in his voice that I hadn't expected from someone my friend often described as laid-back and casual. "That's a thoughtful way to put it," I admitted, smiling. "I never really thought of it that way. Most people just see the water and the ducks and move on." Ethan shrugged, his expression serious but gentle. "Maybe. I like to think about more than what's on the surface." As we continued walking, our conversation drifted to other things, memories of family gatherings, small personal philosophies, and the kind of stories people usually save for late-night talks. And with each step, I felt an unexpected sense of connection, as though the river was quietly carrying us towards something neither of us could predict. There was a moment, somewhere along the bend in the path where willow trees leaned over the water like protective guardians, that he shared something personal. Not a secret in the dramatic sense, but a reflection that revealed a vulnerability I hadn't anticipated. I listened, fully present, realizing that these moments, rare and honest, were sometimes more powerful than years of casual acquaintance. I felt a quiet respect for him then, a mix of admiration and gentle surprise. I could see his mind at work, the way he weighed his words, and the sincerity behind every thought he shared. It wasn't just conversation. It was an exchange of understanding, an unexpected bridge between our generations, our perspectives, our lives. By the time we looped back to where we had started, The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the path and lighting the river in molten gold. I felt lighter somehow, as if the walk had stripped away preconceptions and left something far more meaningful in their place. I said goodbye to Ethan and Marianne, but the quiet impact of our conversation lingered with me long after. I realized that sometimes the people you think you know only superficially can surprise you with insights and reflections that stay with you for a lifetime. And that day by the river, a simple walk had become a moment of discovery, one I wouldn't soon forget. After that afternoon by the river, I found myself thinking about Ethan more often than I expected. It wasn't that I had romantic notions or fanciful daydreams. It was something subtler, quieter. I kept replaying our conversation, his observations, the calm steadiness in the way he spoke. Sometimes, late at night when the house was silent, I could almost hear the lapping of the river and his thoughtful voice commenting on the world around him. It was disarming in the best possible way, and it made me realize how rarely I allowed myself to experience such unexpected connections. A few weeks later, Marianne called me on a Tuesday morning. Her voice carried that same buoyant energy I'd always loved, but there was an extra note of excitement. "I was thinking," she said, "why don't you and Ethan take another walk along the river? Just the two of you this time. It's a beautiful day for it." I hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was entirely appropriate to accept, but something inside me, perhaps curiosity, perhaps the quiet longing for more of that unexpected connection, urged me to say yes. Marianne laughed softly when I mentioned my hesitation, saying, "He'll appreciate it. Trust me, he enjoys your company." So that afternoon I arrived at the park once more. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and blue, with clouds drifting lazily across the horizon. The air smelled of fresh earth and blossoms, and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze created a soothing soundtrack to the day. Ethan was already there, waiting near the edge of the river with that same calm smile, hands tucked into his pockets, as if the world were exactly as it should be. "Hello again," I said, offering a smile. "Hello," he replied, returning the smile with a warmth that made the riverbank feel almost sacred. "I thought we might try walking the other side of the river this time. There's a small path I like, quieter than this one." As we walked, I noticed a shift in our dynamic. There was less tentative observation and more shared comfort. Conversations flowed naturally between us, thoughts about books we'd read, memories of childhood adventures, and reflections on small, ordinary moments that somehow carried great meaning. Ethan had a way of listening that made you feel fully seen, not judged or analyzed, but truly heard. I realized that in his presence, the world seemed to slow down, just enough for you to notice details that normally passed unnoticed. At one point, we paused on a small wooden bridge that arched over a narrower stretch of the river. I leaned slightly on the railing, taking in the sparkling water below, when Ethan spoke again. "You know," he said softly, "I've always felt a kind of comfort being near water. Not just for the view or the calmness, but because it reminds me that life keeps moving, even when things feel stagnant. It's reassuring." I turned to him, studying his profile against the backdrop of the setting sun. There was a quiet intensity in his eyes, a reflective quality that reminded me of the reason I'd felt drawn to our first walk. "I think I understand," I said slowly. "There's a certain peace in knowing that, no matter what happens, the world keeps flowing, and you can choose how to navigate it." He nodded, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was filled with the soft sounds of the river and distant birdsong. I felt a sense of shared understanding, as if we were both acknowledging a truth that didn't need to be spoken aloud. We continued walking, the conversation weaving between lighter anecdotes and deeper reflections. I found myself laughing more freely than I had in months, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with genuine connection. At the same time, I noticed a subtle tension, not uncomfortable, but delicate, a sense of anticipation that accompanied moments when two people truly understand each other but have yet to explore the full depth of that understanding. As the path curved under the shadow of a large oak, Ethan paused and gestured toward a quiet bench overlooking the river. "Shall we sit for a while?" he asked. I agreed, and we sat side by side, watching the sun lower toward the horizon, painting the river in shades of gold and rose. He spoke about his dreams in a way that was candid yet unassuming, the kind of openness that comes from feeling safe and accepted. I shared a few of my own thoughts and memories, not holding back the small vulnerabilities that usually stay tucked away. In that moment, the river became more than just water and reflection. It became a witness to an unexpected friendship that was quietly transforming into something deeply meaningful. I realized that connection doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it sneaks up in small gestures, thoughtful words, and shared silences that linger far longer than ordinary conversation. By the time we finally stood to leave, the sky had softened into twilight, and the first stars began to peek out from the evening sky. Ethan smiled at me, a gentle, knowing smile that carried gratitude, respect, and a hint of wonder at what our conversations had become. I smiled back, feeling a mixture of contentment and anticipation for the next time we would walk together. As I drove home that evening, the memory of the river, the light, and his thoughtful presence stayed with me. I knew that whatever the future held, that day had marked a turning point, not in dramatic ways, but in the subtle, quiet realization that meaningful human connection could be both surprising and profoundly moving. In the days following our second walk, I found myself thinking about Ethan in ways that surprised me. It wasn't obsessive or overwhelming, just a gentle awareness that made my routine feel subtly brighter. I noticed the small things, the way a certain tree reminded me of our conversation, the sound of water in a fountain echoing his words about life's flow. It was curious how someone you barely know could leave such an impression, simply through honesty, attentiveness, and kindness. One Saturday morning, Marianne called again. "I hope this isn't too sudden," she said, "but Evan wants to take you to a little spot upriver. He says it's quiet, and he thinks you'll enjoy it." There was a hesitancy in her voice that made me smile. I said yes without hesitation, curious to see where this walk would take us next. Ethan met me at the park entrance, as usual, carrying a small backpack and wearing a casual jacket against the cool spring air. There was a quiet confidence about him now, a comfort that came from familiarity without forcing closeness. He greeted me with that easy smile of his and said, "I hope you don't mind, I brought some tea. Thought we might sit and enjoy the view." I laughed softly, charmed by the gesture, and followed him along the trail. The path was narrow and winding, lined with wildflowers and grasses swaying gently in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It was the kind of place that made time feel slower, more deliberate, and I appreciated that he had chosen it. As we walked, he spoke quietly about the river's journey, how it had carved the landscape over decades, shaping valleys and meadows. "It's humbling to watch," he said. "Everything changes, slowly but inevitably. And yet some things, like this path, this view, remain constant enough to give you perspective." I nodded, feeling the resonance of his words. There was a wisdom there, tempered by patience and observation, that made me reconsider my own perspective on life. I found myself sharing thoughts I rarely voiced, about my work, my family, and the sense of restlessness that sometimes settled in my chest. He listened, really listened, with no rush, no judgment. Eventually, we reached a small clearing overlooking a bend in the river. Ethan set down his backpack and took out 2 thermoses of tea. He handed me one, and we sat on a fallen log, the river stretching out below us, catching the late afternoon sun. The sound of moving water filled the quiet, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then softly he said, I've been thinking about that first walk we took, about how easy it felt to talk, how open it was. I don't often feel like that with people." His words hung in the air, and I felt a warm, tender recognition. "I know exactly what you mean," I replied. "It's rare to find someone you can just be yourself with, without overthinking or pretending. That feeling doesn't come often, and when it does, you notice it immediately." There was a pause, a shared silence that felt meaningful rather than awkward. The river flowed beneath us, shimmering in gold and silver, a mirror of the sunlight and the quiet reflections of our conversation. I realized that this connection, so unexpected, so genuine, was shaping me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I felt lighter, more aware of the beauty in ordinary moments, and more confident in sharing thoughts I had once kept to myself. We spent the rest of the afternoon wandering along smaller trails, pausing to examine a bird's nest tucked in a tree or to admire the wildflowers clinging to the riverbank. Each moment carried a subtle tension, not in an uneasy way, but in the kind of anticipation that arises when two people are aware of each other's depth and are discovering what lies beneath the surface. At one point, Ethan stopped near a cluster of reeds, turning to me with a thoughtful expression. "I feel like people rush through life without noticing these small things. And yet, if you slow down, really notice, it changes how you see everything else. That's why I like these walks with you. They remind me to pay attention, to reflect, to be present." I felt a lump in my throat, a mix of gratitude and quiet admiration. Here was a man, younger than me, yet offering insights and reflections that were both humbling and inspiring. I realized that the value of connection wasn't tied to age or experience, but to openness, attentiveness, and mutual respect. By the time we returned to the main path, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows and softening the edges of the world. I felt a profound sense of contentment, tempered with the awareness that such moments were fleeting and precious. Ethan walked beside me, the ease between us growing naturally with each step, and I understood that these walks, simple, quiet, and deeply reflective, had become something I anticipated with genuine eagerness. Driving home later that evening, I found myself smiling at the memory of the day, at the depth of conversation, the shared silences, and the small revelations that had surfaced. Sometimes I realized connection doesn't announce itself with fanfare or dramatic gestures. It comes quietly, in the steady presence of someone who sees and values you for who you are, and in moments that linger in your mind long after they've passed. After the walk by the river that day, something felt subtly different in the rhythm of my life. It wasn't dramatic, nothing that anyone else would necessarily notice, but I carried with me a quiet sense of perspective and calm that had been missing for years. I realized that the walks with Ethan, our conversations, and even the shared silences had given me a new way of looking at the world, gentle, thoughtful, and profoundly present. A few weeks later, Ethan suggested we take one final walk before the summer faded entirely. The late afternoon air was warm but not oppressive, filled with the scent of grasses and the faint earthy tang of the river. I met him at the usual spot, feeling the familiar anticipation of our time together, but also a deep sense of gratitude for the friendship that had grown in such a short period. As we strolled along the winding path, I noticed the way the sunlight dappled the river, the way the trees swayed gently, and the way the world seemed softer than usual. Ethan walked beside me, hands tucked casually into his pockets, his gaze both steady and reflective. There was a comfort in that silence, a reassurance in the shared quiet. "You know," he said after a while, "I've been thinking about what these walks have meant. Not just the scenery or the conversations, but the way they've helped me notice things I used to overlook. And I hope you feel the same." I looked at him and smiled, feeling a warmth that wasn't fleeting but steady, a deep acknowledgement of what had developed between us. "I too," I replied. "I never expected to find such meaningful connection in something as simple as a walk by the river. But I feel it, and I'm grateful for it. For a while, we continued walking without speaking, letting the sounds of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of a bird fill the spaces between us. I thought about the subtle shifts in my perspective, how I now paused more often to notice small joys, how I allowed myself to reflect without judgment, and how I felt lighter carrying experiences that were authentic and unforced. Eventually, we reached a bend in the path where a large oak tree leaned slightly over the riverbank, casting a long shadow across the water. We paused there, taking in the view, and I realized that the river had become a symbol of the connection we had nurtured, a quiet, steady presence that carried meaning and offered perspective. "I think this is my favorite spot," Ethan said softly, gesturing toward the river. "It's peaceful, and it makes you think about how life flows, how people come and go, and what matters most." I nodded, feeling the resonance of his words. "It's a good reminder," I said, "that even in small, quiet moments, we can find clarity and understanding. That sometimes connection is the thing that teaches us the most." As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and lavender, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. These walks, these shared moments, had become more than casual afternoons. They had become a space where respect, reflection, and genuine care could thrive. It was rare, I realized, to encounter someone whose presence made you feel both seen and understood without expectation. And I knew that the memories of these walks would stay with me, quietly shaping the way I approached life, conversation, and connection. We turned back along the path slowly, savoring the final moments of daylight. There was no urgency, no need to fill the silence with unnecessary words, just the steady, comforting rhythm of footsteps, the river flowing alongside us, and the shared understanding that some connections are rare and precious, even if they don't fit neatly into ordinary definitions of friendship. When we finally said goodbye, there was a lingering warmth in our parting smile, a mutual acknowledgement that this bond, forged through patience, observation, and thoughtful conversation, had become an enduring part of our lives. Driving home that evening, I reflected on the journey, the initial curiosity, the surprises, the thoughtful dialogue, and the shared silences, and felt a quiet joy. It was a joy rooted not in excitement or drama, but in the simple, profound realization that authentic connection, when nurtured with care and respect, could transform the ordinary into something unforgettable. That night, I sat by my window, listening to the faint murmur of the river in the distance, and I realized that these walks had given me more than memories. They had given me perspective, patience, and a renewed appreciation for the subtle ways people can touch our lives. Life, like the river, keeps moving, but every now and then it carries someone alongside you, and together, even for a little while, you can move with it in a way that feels completely right. And for me, that someone was Ethan.